Hello, this is Dr. Martel, and clearly I got a haircut, finally. Got my coffee, so ready to go. In this lecture, I want to first provide some background on Augustine, our next philosopher, and then explain the problem or problems that this book on free choice of the will is mainly intended to solve. Okay? That's the problem or problems of evil. Then I'll get into book 1 and book 2. I'm going to try and do a fairly close or offer a fairly close reading of book 1, and I'll hold off on detailed discussion of book 2 until the next lecture, during which I'll probably also cover the contents, or at least some of the contents of book 3. So first, some background about Augustine. By the time Augustine is living and writing, a great deal of time has passed since Plato was around. So Plato dies, in about 348, 347 BCE. Augustine is not even born until 354 AD, so Common Era. And he dies in 430 AD. In some respects, the world that Augustine inhabits is very similar to the world that Plato inhabited. Plato's philosophy, for instance, it is still a live option among intellectuals, at least during the early part of Augustine's life. I believe the school that he founded continued in existence for like hundreds of years after his death. And so like intellectuals, philosophers in particular of Augustine's day would have been very, very familiar with either Plato's views or what they took to be Plato's views, or the views of people who claim to kind of elaborate on or better renew Plato's philosophy. These people are sometimes called Neoplatonists. Several of the philosophies that were created in Athens, or at least schools for them were founded in Athens, like shortly after Plato's death. Several of those philosophies would also continue to have adherents. So one of the schools of philosophy that was founded after Plato's death was Stoicism. Augustine is familiar with the Stoics. There are such people still in his day. And to the best of my knowledge, he was probably familiar too with at least Epicurean thought. Epicurus is another Athenian philosopher who founded a great school in Athens, which was very influential, had many students, and continued to exist for hundreds of years. But a number of important changes occurred between Plato and Augustine. For one thing, Augustine was born into very, very different political arrangements. So Plato was a member of a polis, and that's a citizen-run community of a relatively small size. So even the largest polis in Plato's day only consisted of a few tens of thousands of citizens. Athens was one of the larger ones. Of course, there were more people who lived in Athens than just the citizens. But even if you included them, you'd be talking about a relatively small number of people compared to the Roman Empire. Augustine was born into the Roman Empire, specifically into the North African part of it. I believe a place that is now part of Tunisia. Okay, so that's where he comes from. Rome, as many of you know, actually, according to its historians, it started out rather like many Greek communities of the classical period started out. It started out as kind of a petty principality. It had a king or kings, but not too long after this period of monarchy, the Romans, like the Greeks, established a republic. And they mean apparently by republic very, very much something like what the Greeks meant by polis. So this is it's a citizen-run community, and that helps to explain why like early Latin translations of Plato's Politeia, right, are the republic. Anyway, at about the same time that the Romans finally like subjugated all of the Greeks and became the dominant power in the Mediterranean world. At about that same time, they ceased to be a republic, and they became instead, again, something like a monarchy. They didn't just have an empire. The Romans themselves, like for all intents and purposes, were actually ruled by, like, at a time anyway, like one person, right? The emperor, starting with Augustus. So that's how things are when Augustine is born and during the course of most of his life. It is also the case that during the course of most of his life, the Roman Empire is like in great or experiencing great turmoil. There are a number of different competing belief systems, and like Christianity is just one of them. And I'll get into some more of that in a bit. But the Romans are also, their empire is also under great stress as a result of outside forces, so-called barbarians, trying to and succeeding in breaking in. And this would eventually lead to, I believe, like the sacking of Rome, not terribly long after Augustine's death. And that is roughly when, I believe, the Western Roman Empire, as opposed to the Eastern part, which became the Byzantine Empire, and civilization. The Western Roman Empire is no more. It falls. So Augustine is living at the sort of the tail end of what is pretty clearly a period of decline in the Roman Empire, the Western part of it in particular. Again, he's born into the North African part of the empire, and this is actually indicated by that painting that appears in the slideshow that I've created to accompany the lecture this week. That painting was not a painting made by anyone who actually ever met Augustine. It's a Renaissance painting, so it's a kind of best guess from someone who lived like 1,000 years later. But it's a guess based upon what the painter knew about Augustine's origins. Augustine's mother was a native to the place, so North Africa, present-day Tunisia, right? And so I think that the painter guessed that Augustine probably looked a great deal like the people who inhabited that part of the world when the painter himself was alive. So, right, kind of like darker complexion, right, than you would ordinarily expect from like Western Europeans. Augustine's father, though, was he was a Roman official, and I don't know, but I doubt he was a local. Another difference between the father and the mother: the father was a pagan, and the mother was a Christian. And I believe actually the mother went on to be canonized, and so I think she's a saint of the Catholic Church. Yeah, the father, on the other hand, was someone who even by then might have been called pagan. So I have a digression here. I think the word pagan has a really interesting history. I think it started out as a term that sophisticated urban Romans would use to talk about more or less hillbillies. so like simple country, relatively poor country folk uneducated, right, with a whole bunch of like backward beliefs about the world. Christians, by the time Christianity became like an accepted religion within the empire, in part because an emperor was a Christian, Constantine, and a religion that was like growing in power, Christians had appropriated this term and came to use it to talk about basically anyone that was not a Jew, that was not a Christian. So his father's pagan and Roman official, and his mother is a local. One more thing about that painting. Nobody actually knows if it's accurate. No, I mean, to the best of my knowledge, nobody knows how Augustine like actually looked. He's usually not portrayed that way. He's usually portrayed as if he hails from like somewhere in Sweden, like more or less, which doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense. But no one knows. No one knows though which portrayal is accurate, and I think that too is, I think, kind of interesting. No one knows because we haven't been told, and probably no one has told us because they did not regard it as important. They didn't regard it as something that really was worth noting, and this makes sense to me. I mean, at that time, as I already indicated, like there are important differences that are recognized to exist between people. There are, but they don't have a heck of a lot to do with like certain obvious physical characteristics like hair texture or skin tone or the shape of one's nose. They have a heck of a lot to do with culture. Right? I think I also alluded to this fact when talking about the Greeks and like who counted as a Greek and who did not count as a Greek. A main way of distinguishing people is, are you civilized? So like us Romans and Greeks, right? Or are you one of these barbarous people? Okay. Augustine, clearly, right, was a civilized person. It could go without saying. So no one needed to tell us that. And these people seem not to distinguish among civilized people by way of, like, again, these like physical characteristics, which seem to be so important to us these days. Anyway, in his early life, Augustine was actually torn, sort of between his father's world and his mother's world. So he was financially relatively well off, and as a result, like, he was also very, very well educated. As a young man, he became very enamored of the works of the great Roman politician and orator and even philosopher Cicero, right? Which I actually think in Latin is probably Cicero. But he was especially interested in Cicero's like works on rhetoric and his basically displays of rhetorical prowess. Cicero was something of a virtuoso when it came to speaking persuasively. Augustine also, probably by way of Cicero, became very familiar with and probably attracted to also Plato's views. As they were presented in Plato's school, the Academy, at the time that Cicero became familiar with the views of that school. Those philosophers, they're sometimes called academicians, and they're Platonists of of a peculiar sort, though. They're philosophers who seem to be skeptics. And I'm going to talk about skeptics more later in the class, especially when we get to Descartes. Skepticism is like an old trend, and it was even at one time a school in philosophy. It was sort of a Greek school. Skepticism, though, in general in philosophy has to do with like the denial of knowledge, right? Basically saying no to either all knowledge claims, which is a very radical skepticism, or certain classes of knowledge claim. Right? Like there are to this day people who are skeptical about morality. They don't just doubt, but they deny that there's any knowledge possible even of what is morally right and morally wrong. Other people are religious skeptics. These are people who are, I guess you call them agnostic. They don't think that knowledge is possible of, for instance, like God's existence, whether God exists or does not exist. So the version of Plato's philosophy that Augustine would have been familiar with by way of Cicero is a version on which Plato's a skeptic. He's someone who basically like teaches us how to like undermine like claims to know. Although Augustine himself in other writings discusses this point. Although this skepticism of someone like Plato and his students, right, the academicians, this skepticism is actually in the service of a truth which can be known. But the idea, I think, was that the only way to come to know it would be to first find doubtful and then reject much of what ordinary people, right, and novice students take themselves to know. So it's kind of like a skepticism in the service of something like a hidden truth. Later still, if I have my chronology right, Augustine became maybe not an adherent of, but someone who was very interested in what is sometimes classified as a Gnostic heresy. Gnosticism, I believe, refers to like a host of like a collection, rather disparate collection of belief systems that were fairly widespread in the Roman world during Augustine's lifetime and somewhat before it too. These belief systems were religious, and I believe they were either then or now, or I'm sorry, either then or shortly after their heyday, called heresies because they were viewed as being competitors. They were viewed as competing with like the true religion, Christianity, and not just Christianity, but a certain version of Christianity that figures like Augustine, who eventually became a high official in the church. They were viewed as competitors to that version that people like Augustine accepted and endorsed. He became interested in one of these heretical doctrines in particular, and people sometimes call it Manichaeism, but I believe the correct pronunciation is actually Manichaeism. It gets its name from the founder of this belief system, and the founder was a man named Mani, who came from the mysterious East, as much of this stuff seems to. It's to the best of my knowledge, it's a version of Zoroastrianism. So Zoroastrianism is itself a doctrine that's named after its founder, Zoroaster, and was for a time the dominant religion within the sort of the Persian sphere of influence. And that religion is actually strikingly similar to what eventually became Christianity. Zoroastrians believe in a god who is like dominant and most powerful and good, and who really wills there to be like order in the world. Right? So bringing order is itself good, and human beings who bring and perpetuate this God's order are good. So like farmers, good people. But in this system, there's another deity, a lesser one. I think actually Zoroastrians called this being by a name that is very similar to our word devil. And this being, of course, doesn't want order, doesn't want things to be in good order. And of course, there are some human beings who kind of fall in line with this other being. And so the Zoroastrians kind of viewed much of what happens in this world as a conflict between these two forces, so like good and evil. Right? So the Manichaean doctrine is a little bit different. There's sort of a couple of twists to it. One twist is this. In the Manichaean doctrine, right, it's fairly clear that like there's a good God and there's a bad God. Okay, but it's not really clear that the bad God is like subordinate to the good God. The good God is in conflict with the bad God, and the good God will win, like assuredly. The Manichaeans tell us. But it's not as though I don't think anyway. Like the good God is supposed to have some like created everything else that exists, including the bad God. Also, according to Manichaeans, the good God did not create this world. I mean, clearly, look around. I mean, so I live in a part of town where, as of a couple of weeks ago, I would hear like munitions go off every night because like maybe like 5 blocks that way, people were trying to burn down the police union building, and 5 blocks that way, people were trying to burn down the North Portland Police Precinct. It was difficult for me to get a haircut in part because like everything was like shut down in town for about like a week because of like massive forest fires, and like we're doing this right now instead of actually like doing it the way human beings do it. That is like like in person because of like a global pandemic. I mean, and have you seen who the presidential candidates are? I mean, in the U.S. like clearly, right? This is like the Manichaean perspective. This is not a world that a good God created. This is a world created by the baddie, and it's the misfortune of some good people who have good souls. So good human beings who have good souls. That they find themselves in this wicked world, but they have reason to hope, and the reason to hope is this, according to the Manichaeans: the good God is going to come and like completely destroy this world. So the good God will bring the end of the world, and that will be a good thing. And these few truly good people with like really good souls, they will be kind of like raptured away. So that's Manichaeism, and you may not be able to like entirely appreciate its virtues right now. And I in fact in this lecture probably cannot adequately convey the reasons for its appeal to the young Augustine. I will try and show a little bit of what he must have found appealing about it when we get to that problem or those problems of evil. If you've encountered the problem or problems of evil before, you may already have some sort of like sense for what the appeal might be. This Manichaean system turns out to offer a very elegant solution to that problem or problems. So, Manichaeism. Augustine, though, eventually he broke from that too. He would remain very, very concerned with evil, and like there's no there are people in philosophy who have actually claimed that there actually isn't any evil in the world. It's that's just an illusion. Like everything is actually like good. Augustine is not one of those people, right? So like there is evil, and it causes like theological problems for him. But he chose ultimately not to address those problems in this Manichaean way. He finally converted to Christianity. How, we don't know. I mean, Augustine's, in addition to authoring on free choice of the will, he also authors like two actually more important and more famous and also much longer books. One is City of God, and the other is the Confessions. And in the Confessions, he tells a little story about how it is that he converted, but it's probably not to be believed. But anyway, he did convert, and as an educated man, highly educated man, excellent writer. He learned his Cicero really well. He rose very, very quickly through the ranks, such as they were, and eventually became bishop in the part of the world that he was from. That's in like North Africa. He became the bishop of Hippo. So, what is this problem of evil, or what are these problems of evil? A problem or problems that had something to do with this attraction that Manichaeism had for Augustine, and this problem or problems that on free choice of the will is meant to solve. Well, in the slide presentation, you'll see like a formal, brief statement of the two. There actually are two problems, right? And I've stated the problems in the form of arguments. So if you look at the slide with the problems, you'll see a couple of arguments, one on the left, one on the right. And I present the arguments in both cases in the following way. So I present premises on numbered lines, like 1, 2, 3, and then below that, below them as the final line, final numbered line, the conclusion, right? Premises are statements that offer evidence for believing something. Either independent evidence or evidence that's supposed to work with other evidence so as to show something is the case, right? What the evidence is evidence for, that's the conclusion. The conclusion in both cases is that the God of Christianity does not exist. The conclusion is not that like God doesn't exist. Maybe God does exist, or maybe gods exist, but that God that Christians worship, yeah, there's no such thing. So ordinarily, when the problem of evil, sorry, I can't help but say that, because ordinarily, right, these problems are presented to students as if it's just one problem. And the one problem is that supposedly, right, is the problem with evil. That one problem is the problem that I believe in the slides appears on the left-hand side of the screen. Okay, so the argument goes like this, and you may have encountered it in this form. If it is the case that God is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent, so like a perfectly good will, then there is no evil. That's the first premise. Second premise, there's evil. Third, conclusion then. It is not the case that God is omniscient, omnipotent, and perfectly good. Something's got to give, right? Either God isn't all powerful, or God isn't all knowing, or God is not of perfectly good will. And if any of those things are true, Christianity is false, right? Because the God of Christianity has all the power, knows everything, and is of perfectly good will. So let me review an important part of this argument that might not be clear, and that's that first premise. So if God has the three O's, I like to say, like omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent, then there's no evil. Like you might wonder, like, well, why would anyone think that is true? Well, for one thing, if God is all-knowing, then God would know of any evil that occurs, or has occurred, or that would occur in the future, right? Like part of being God is not being surprised, ever. God would know of any evil that there is, has been, or would be. If God is all powerful, then surely God could prevent any evil that there is, was, or would be. Right? And surely a being that's perfectly good prevents all evil that being is capable of preventing. Well, God's capable of preventing all evil, right? Because of this knowledge and power. Therefore, this God with the three O's, omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, right, would in fact act so as to eliminate like all evil, right, or as to ensure that like no evil ever exists. But plainly, evil does exist. So that God is off the table as a theological option. So that's the problem of evil as it's ordinarily presented, especially to undergraduates in philosophy classes. But it's not the only problem of evil, and indeed, historically, it's not even the most important problem of evil. As I'll try to explain next week or in the next lecture, like Augustine is familiar with this line of reasoning, but he's not primarily concerned with it. He's primarily concerned with a different problem where evil is concerned, and this other problem is sometimes called the holiness problem. So the problem that I just went over, the one having to do with like the three O's, that's sometimes called the underachiever problem. Because the argument is an argument for an underachieving God, like a God who either can't or won't eradicate all evil, right, or prevent all evil. The other problem is called the holiness problem, because the conclusion of this argument is a conclusion to the effect that God is not holy. Here's how it goes. So God, according to Christians, makes everything that isn't God. Out of nothing. So that's quite an accomplishment. And humans, so God causes, right? Everything, including humans. God causes humans. And humans cause evil. Well, it seems to be the case that causation is transitive. So that if X causes Y and Y causes Z, then X causes Z. It's a transitive relation. Okay, so God causes humans and humans cause evil. Well then, it seems as though you're forced to admit that God is the ultimate cause of evil in the world. Well then, God is not holy, right? Whatever holiness amounts to, it excludes being the agent of evil. It excludes being, another way of putting it, it excludes being an evil doer, right? So that's actually what I think people in the ancient world, like Augustine, and even people gone into the Middle Ages, that's what, and even like early modern period, that's what they would have understood, I think, as the problem of evil. If somebody chose misleadingly to speak that way about theological problems with evil. So, on free choice of the will, it is written largely in order to address these problems, principally in order to address that second problem, the holiness problem. And this actually tells us something really important about a great deal of Christian philosophy. So not just like Augustine's Christian philosophy, but a lot of the Christian philosophy that was generated within Western Christendom. So like following late antiquity, the fall of the Roman Empire, sort of the rise of feudal Western Europe. A lot of this philosophy is actually designed to like clarify religious belief and to solve various problems with the Christian belief system. Okay. And Christian philosophers like Augustine and subsequent Christian philosophers like people like Thomas Aquinas, they're going to find Greek philosophy in particular, ancient Greek philosophy, a very important resource for, again, this project of clarification and solution of problems that seem to be inherent in the theology, right, that Christians accept. Okay. Plato, in particular, we'll see even by the end of this lecture, probably actually by the middle of it, is a very important resource for Augustine in this respect. Okay? And indeed, I don't think it'd be too much of a stretch to say that Augustine is, in a way, kind of offering or espousing a Christianity that synthesizes a lot of either Plato's thought or the thought of like the New Platonists, the Neoplatonists, with Christian dogma, and especially with what will become like right belief among Christians, so like Orthodox belief. So we know from Book 1, right at the outset, that the book is about the holiness problem because it's a dialogue, right? Like the Republic, like Plato's Politeia. It's a dialogue. One of the characters is Augustine, and the other character is a fellow student, supposed to be a fellow student of his, named Evodius. And Evodius asked Augustine, "Is God the cause of evil?" So there you go, right? Why would anyone ask this question? Well, that clearly, like, this person like is familiar with that argument, the holiness problem presented as an argument. So, right, the first thing that Augustine does in the dialogue is to get clear on what Evodius is asking about. Like, okay, like, first of all, what are you talking about with evil? And a discussion ensues, which results in the claim that evil falls basically into like two categories. So the stuff that we call evil, right, it belongs to one category or the other. And as I think I've said in the slideshow, those categories are like evil suffered and evil done. Okay, so best examples of evil suffered are things like, well, like what we just had in the Portland area, where there are these raging out of control fires in surrounding forested lands, and the city is just inundated with this choking, disabling smoke for like a week on end. So like a natural disaster, right, would be like an evil suffered. Pestilence, plague, yeah, like coronavirus and the disease it causes, COVID-19. Yeah, that'd be another example of an evil suffered. I suppose like evil done would be something like beating somebody up contrary to law, and the force that one is entitled to use by law if you're a law enforcement official. But also like throwing a Molotov cocktail at people. That'd also be like evil doing. So right, like Augustine wants to say, you know what? In answer to your question, then, yes, God is the cause of some of what's called evil, and that specifically, God is the cause of evil suffered. Okay. And let's say that does not mean that God is an evildoer, because the evil that is suffered, in particular the evil that humans suffer, is actually divine retribution. It's divine payback for the evil that people do. And so rather than being really evil, it's actually good. It doesn't feel that way when you're on the receiving end, but that's what it is. It's just. Giving people what they have coming is just. It's what they're owed. It's what they're due. Right? We're familiar with that view from Republic, right? That was Polemarchus's view, and it turns out to be not all that different than Plato's view. Yeah. Okay. That just leaves then the problem of evil doing. That's really evil, Augustine wants to say. So is God the cause of that? Now, if God was the cause of that, right, then God would be an evildoer, and so that's at odds with what Christians think about God. So this would be tantamount to saying that the God that Christians believe in doesn't exist. Okay, so in order to answer this question, is God the cause of evil doing? We first need to know better what evil doing, or as I said in the slides, I believe following the text, wrongdoing is. And so a discussion then ensues that again should look very familiar to you. It should look like, again, that discussion of justice at the beginning of Republic. Remember, the participants are basically after a definition that is like a perfect fishing net. It captures only and all of what you're interested in, of what the term applies to. So several proposed definitions are considered before we hit on the right one. And I know this can seem somewhat tedious. Why doesn't he just cut to the chase? Well, two reasons. One, he wants to be persuasive, and again, Augustine was someone who was very fond of rhetoric, right, the art of persuasive speech, and so he wants to consider views of wrongdoing that his readers are likely to have. Better to explicitly consider those views and refute them than to not mention them. Also, though, he wants to introduce other elements of what I'm going to call, for lack of a better word, word a worldview that he has. And again, it's this worldview that kind of synthesizes Christian dogma with Plato's thought. So, like Evodius, like the first thing he says, well, you know, I think that wrongdoing is a matter of like doing to others what you would not like them to do to you. And that makes sense. That sounds a little bit like the golden rule, doesn't it? Not the rule about gold, but like the other one, right? Do unto others as you would have them. But surprisingly, Augustine rejects it, and he rejects it for what are actually kind of like amusing reasons. Like I'm not making this up. If you read the text, he says like, look, I mean, you know, I mean, there are people who they commit adultery. Well, he's like, well, yeah, sure, of course I know that, but like they do it like in a reciprocal fashion, like they commit adultery with each other's wives, and Bodhi says, oh yes, I've heard of this, but and this is also not like it's consensual. so Bodhi says, yeah, well, I mean, is that wrong? And Augustine, Bodhi says, well, yeah, of course it's wrong. Yes, of course that's wrong. And Augustine says, but yeah, like, but neither party to this is doing what they don't want done by doing to the other what they don't want the other to do to them. So that definition of wrongdoing fails because it leaves out like what essentially amounts to wife swapping or like spouse swapping. So like Evodius then offers up another proposed definition for wrongdoing. He says, well, like maybe it's acting out of desire for things that you can lose against your will. Okay. So what kinds of things can you lose against your will? Well, I mean, like private property, right? You can lose against your will. I suppose you can lose your liberty, like legally, like against your will. You could be imprisoned. You could lose your life against your will. So there's this underlying idea here that people should not be overly concerned with things that are not in their power, fully in their power. They instead should be concerned with what is fully in their power. Okay? And I mentioned I think at the beginning of this lecture that Augustine was familiar with the thought of the Stoics. That's very much a Stoic idea. Okay? Like your focus, according to the Stoics, should be on what you have power over. What you have power over is something that like it can't be taken away from you against your will. And you go wrong, according to Stoics, when you really place value in your beliefs and in your actions on things that you don't have complete power over. Right? So Augustine says, like, that's better, but there's still a problem here, and that's the problem of self-defense. So Augustine says, look, I mean, it's not wrong for somebody to kill in self-defense, like under certain conditions, right? Where the other person really is like an imminent danger, an imminent threat to one's life. Augustine says, under those conditions, it's not wrong to take the life of another human being. But surely you're doing this. The person who kills in self-defense, surely that person is doing that out of the desire to keep something that they can lose against their will, their life. And Evodius like, I don't know. And I say, but look, I mean, there's no law that we know of in anywhere in the world that punishes people for killing in self-defense, right? And Augustine's like, then this makes sense. Like even if killing another person in self-defense were a bad thing, it's so much worse, right? That someone else get away with killing a completely innocent person. And so all the laws all over the world that we know of agree. That's not punished, killing someone in self-defense. So it looks like it's not wrong. But it would be wrong on your definition, right? Your definition, again, of odious is wrongdoing is acting out of desire for things that we can lose against our will. So Odious now, he distinguishes between two kinds of law. What he calls, I think it's like divine law on the one hand and human law on the other. And the idea is this. Okay, well, maybe for practical reasons of the kind to which you've just alluded, Augustine, maybe no human law, so rules that human beings make and enforce in this world. No human law punishes people who kill in self-defense, legitimately, really. But maybe, right, those people who do this are still punished by God, according to God-given laws, sort of God's rules for living. Right? And so maybe you're incorrect in saying that there is no set of laws that punishes people for doing this, for killing in self-defense. Augustine says, okay, look, I like that distinction that you've just made, the distinction between divine law and human law. And what I want to do is, to help us clarify what wrongdoing is, I want to make a very similar distinction. And I'm going to distinguish then between eternal law, and this is law that holds everywhere and at all times and is unchanging. Right? So that's very much like God-given law. And temporal law. And temporal law is what holds, as the name indicates, right, at various times and in various places. Right? So the human law that Odious was just talking about, that would be an example of temporal law, right? Whatever laws the Romans had, they were different, at least in part, from laws that the Chinese would have had at approximately the same time, or laws that people in various parts of what is now India would have had at approximately the same time. So temporal law varies, right? Changes over time, exists at some times and not at other times. Now Augustine says, right, let me try and illustrate the difference. So I want you to imagine two cities. So in one city, the citizens, they are for the most part people who have a great deal of self-discipline. So they act according to their best judgment. Right? They're not sort of overcome by desire. Right? They're also reasonably well educated, at least about matters pertaining to the community as a whole. Right? So public affairs. And let's suppose too that they're very civic-minded. So these are people who are motivated to regularly do things for the common good. Right? That's being civic-minded. That's one city. Compare it with another city. In this city, people are, as I put in the slideshow, they're incontinent, and I don't mean that they have the problems that are ordinarily associated with incontinence in English. I mean that these are people who don't have a great deal of self-control. They're sort of regularly overwhelmed by their desires, no matter how irrational those desires might be. They're also people who are, let's say, not particularly like well-educated about public matters, and they're really not civic minded. They're each of them is really just out for number one. So like very self-interested in the narrow sense. And Augustine asks, so like what kind of laws should exist, do you think, Evodius, in that first city? The one with the well-educated, self-disciplined, civic-minded people. Like, for instance, like how should officials, such as there are, how should officials in that first city be selected? Who should select them? And Evodius says, oh, well, by law, the citizens should select them. So, I mean, it should be something like elections. Right? And so what we're talking about here in that first city is a republic by law, right? This is a citizen-ruled community. That law fits those people. Okay, so that's what the temporal law should be there in that city. But now consider the other city. And this is the city of people who are, again, they're incontinent. They are ignorant and very narrowly self-interested. Now, by law, how should their officials be selected? Should you leave it up to them? How's that going to go? And Evodius is like, no, okay, like these people need a king, basically. They need someone like wiser than they are to manage their affairs for them as a parent manages the affairs of their children, right? And the law there should make for that arrangement, right? Monarchy. So the temporal law differs in these two places. So here we have an example of, or actually examples of temporal laws. And now Augustine asks Evodius, well, how is it that you know that one set of temporal laws should hold in the first city and another set of temporal laws should hold in the second city? How are you reasoning here? Right? And the conclusion that Augustine draws out in this part of the dialogue is that Evodius must have been reasoning from a principle that holds for both cities, and indeed for any city. Okay, so this is going to be a principle that holds like everywhere, at all times. It's an eternal principle. Okay, this is an eternal law, and the principle is, I believe in our text is stated this way, like everything should be in due order. Right? So like everything should be in its proper place. Right? People should stay in their lanes, like something to that effect. People should get what they're due. Ignorant, selfish, undisciplined people are due basically a government that acts as a parent. That's what they're owed. That's what's fitting for them, right? Because they're essentially like children as far as like public affairs are concerned. Knowledgeable, self-disciplined, civic-minded people, right? They're entitled to run their own affairs because they are, after all, like in civic matters, they're adults. Okay, so one eternal, unchanging principle has different implications for the temporal law, right? Depending upon changing conditions from place to place, and of course, like from time to time. Okay, so now Augustine asks, this eternal law, everything should be in due order. Like what implications does that have for the human psyche? So, okay, what's going on here is that like what we've just been talking about is essentially due order in society. Right? And now what we're talking about, we're using that discussion to now inform us about due order in the human soul. And that should remind you of somebody. So, according to Augustine, there are at least two parts of the human psyche. One clearly is desire. We've been talking about that for some time, right? It's a source of trouble. And but in addition to that, there's reason, and whatever the word is in the original Latin here, it's probably pretty close to the English reason. So, right, two of the same parts in Plato's account of the soul or psyche. And you might wonder at this point, well, like, where's the third? In Plato, there was a third, and in the Greek, it was thumos. And we talked a bit about problems with translating that term. And I think I noted that, like, spirit is not a bad translation. And whatever it is, whatever the terms we use, what we're talking about here is something like basically what gets people going, right, in a fight. It's like which gives them a lot of fight in the course of carrying out a conflict. The third part for Augustine turns out to be something different, and it's will. It's will. So before getting into his account of how the eternal law applies to the soul, everything should be in due order. How does that apply to the soul? I want to say a bit about like how Augustine conceives of the will at this point in the dialogue. I do think it is going to change a bit by the third book. He'll add something very important. But for now, will is the power of voluntary action. Okay. So it's due to the fact that you have a will that you're able to do things voluntarily. And that makes sense because voluntarily just means, as a matter of fact, willfully. So will is the power of doing things willfully or willingly. I should probably better say willingly. Okay. No one does something voluntarily if they are coerced or forced to do it. And so, right, Augustine thinks of the power of the will as uncoerced. Right? We are not forced by anything outside of ourselves to will as we do. Okay, so will is uncoerced. He also thinks, he doesn't explicitly say this part, but I think this is in the background. Okay? He also thinks that it doesn't make any sense to say that someone tried to will something, but failed. there's no trying but failing where willing is concerned. Now, if you will to do something, you might try and fail to do it, but you can't try and fail to will. So the will is like this. I think I put it this way in the slideshow. It's like this unfailing power. Right? So as Augustine puts it, in order to simply will something, you need do nothing more than to will it. to will something is tantamount to willing it. Okay. So yet another way of putting it, if you're able to direct someone, like command them, like in an unfailing way, right? Like they always do exactly as you say. It's fair to say that you have them completely in your power. In Augustine's view, then, right, our will, one's will, your will, is completely in your power. Right? So, yeah, the will is uncoerced, and the content of your will, what you will, is completely in your power. Okay, back to how this eternal law, which I imagine up here, applies to the human soul. Okay. So the eternal law is that everything should be in due order. What is it for the human psyche to be in due order? Again, there are no surprises here if you're familiar with Plato's view. Reason should rule, right? Reason should be the leader, the leading part in the human soul, in the human psyche. And desire should be subordinate to reason. So what we should do then is to act on our desires insofar as they are in accordance with the rational ordering of our own life. Okay, so we should act on desire only insofar as it is in accordance with the dictates of reason. So, what's wrongdoing? Okay, wrongdoing is Augustine was right about this. Wrongdoing is acting on desire, and he's even right that it's a matter of acting on desire for things that we can lose against our will, right? Things that we don't have complete power over, like things that aren't like our own will. This includes like our life, property, other people of whom we are fond, our legal liberty, and so forth. Okay, but it's not just wrongdoing. It's not just acting on desire for things that we can lose against our will. Instead, it's acting on desire for things that we can lose against our will, contrary to the dictates of reason. Right? And so it's a matter of acting from what is in our text. The translation is inordinate desire. Okay, this is like a disorderly desire. Desire that is contrary to the order that should be in our lives according to reason. Right. Last thing. How is it that wrongdoing in this sense can ever occur? You do wrong when your soul is in kind of like an undue order, right? Reason, instead of ruling, is actually subordinate to desire, right? Which actually should be ruled. How can this ever come about? Augustine says, well, look, I mean, it can't come about by way of like bad influences from other people, because like the bad influence of other people is an influence of people who are like, if it's really a bad influence, it's an influence from people who are corrupt, and corrupt things can't make better things worse. He says, whether you agree with that or not, the dialogue continues. And it doesn't seem as though like reason by nature can ever become subordinate to desire. And reason by nature is like it's made to like govern the whole of the psyche and thereby govern the whole of the human being. Things that are built to do a certain job in the world, things that by nature do something. They tend to do it unless something else like interferes. And so the root of this disorder in the soul, and thus the root of wrongdoing, must be the will, which again is like uncoerced and completely within one's own power. And so ultimately what Augustine wants to say is this: wrongdoing is willingly acting from inordinate desire, this desire that is contrary to the dictates of reason. Okay, and that means, of course, that it follows that wrongdoing is voluntary. Wrongdoing is voluntary action. And it's at this point that you would think, maybe, that the problem of evil that Augustine was originally focused on, it basically should be solved, and that's the holiness problem, right? Because basically what Augustine has shown here is that if anyone is responsible for the genuine evil that exists in the world, it's the people who voluntarily do it. Okay, right. We hold those people responsible who voluntarily perform the actions in question. Right? Like, they're the ones that we praise, or they're the ones that we blame. So wrongdoing is the real evil. It's voluntary. Who then is responsible? Right? If the responsible party is the evildoer, like who is the evildoer? It's the human agent, or the human agents, who willingly transgress eternal law, that everything should be in due order, by acting on unreasonable desires. Right? That's who does these things voluntarily, and so that is who is responsible. Right? That's who the evildoer is. If all that's so, then it simply makes no sense, right, to say that, like, somebody else, God, is somehow responsible for these actions, right? If someone, me, say, right, is the person who voluntarily did something, which counts as evil, then I'm responsible for it. Like, I in a sense own it. It's mine. I'm the evildoer. If I granted all that, it would make no sense. It would be absolutely preposterous for me to, like, then say, oh yeah, I'm the evildoer here, but this other person is to this other person is to blame. Even if that other person was somehow the cause of me doing what I did. Let me give an example of this. Like, there'd be no me without my parents. I won't go into the details, but so they're the cause of me, and my parents wouldn't exist without, like, my grandparents, and my grandparents would not have existed. They were caused by my great grandparents. Okay. So suppose I willingly do something that is unquestionably wrong. My great-grandparents caused me, right? And I caused the wrong. Would it make any sense for me to blame them? Okay, yeah, I'm the evildoer here, but guess what? I'm not alone. My great-grandparents made me, so they're responsible too. Clearly, that doesn't make any sense, right? So, if the real evil in the world is, as Augustine says it is, it seems like God cannot be held responsible for it. We cannot say that God is an evildoer, even though it does look like we can tell a story about cause and effect, according to which God is like the ultimate cause of the wrongdoing in question. Of course, God is a little bit different relative to me than my great-grandparents are, right? As it may have occurred to some of you at this point. My great-great-grandparents, for instance, they're no longer with us, and so they couldn't stop me from doing wrong. Like even if they somehow could have foretold that I would do it. They also didn't have like perfect foreknowledge of the fact that at various points in my life I would do wrong, and you know, to the best of my knowledge, they were pretty good people, but I don't think they were like omnibenevolent, like perfectly good people. God is significantly different than my great grandparents in these respects, and so perhaps there's still a problem here. The problem of absolving God from any responsibility for the evil that I and other people do. Augustine realizes this, and so he'll come back to this problem, this version of the problem of evil in Book 3. Okay. Meantime, let me just say a few things about Book 2 before concluding this lecture. So, Augustine in Book 1 essentially argued that this power that God gave us, the power that he calls will, it's the ultimate root of all the evil, that there genuinely is, like genuine evil in the world, right? All the other stuff that people call evil, that's just God's just payback for punishment, right? For the evil that human beings do. This leads Evodius to like wonder aloud. Well, then, I mean, maybe God should not have given us this power to will, because it's the root of all the evil in the world. Like maybe what God should have done instead is like not give us this power of like doing things voluntarily. And you know, if God did something that God should not have done, or I should put it this way, if God did something or failed to do something that you know like allowed there to be evil in the world, kind of like unnecessarily, then God doesn't seem to be all that Christians have God cracked up to be. God would seem to be, you know, lesser. So to address this question that Evodius has about whether it would have been better, right, for human beings not to have will, or we could also say free will, right, because will is supposed to be uncoerced and completely within one's power. In order to address this question, Augustine says, well, I'm going to have to approach this question by asking and then answering other questions, 3 in particular. First, I want to ask the question of whether God exists. Okay, we've been assuming up to this point that God does exist. After all, these people are both Christians in the dialogue. But first, I'm going to try to like explicitly answer the question: does God exist? And I'm going to try to answer it affirmatively by giving an argument, right, to this effect, a proof of a sort for the existence of God. So that's one question: does God exist? The answer is going to be yes. I'll have a proof. Second, do all good things come from God? That's the second question. And again, he's going to argue in the affirmative. All good things come from God. And third, is the free will among those good things? And again, he'll argue in the affirmative. I will, in the next lecture, go into much more detail regarding Augustine's proof of the existence of God, and then of course how he addresses those other questions that he says he needs to talk about in Book 2. That'll be next time. For now, I just want to say a few things about this very, very odd proof that Augustine gives for the existence of God. It's not the only such proof that's been offered in the history of philosophy. Many such proofs have been offered. If you took a conventional philosophy of religion class, you'd probably spend a good deal of the semester actually studying these other arguments. Probably not this one. We'll encounter another argument for the existence of God when we get to Descartes. Another not very convincing argument, but there you go. This argument is I have to say, compared to those other arguments, it's absolutely bizarre. And when I first read it, I didn't understand what the heck was going on. As you can see in the slide presentation, it starts out saying that something like if there's anything that's superior to reason, right? Either that's God, or there is something even better than it, and that's God. Okay, that alone is like a really like strange claim to make. I mean, it doesn't even seem like remotely like plausible. It seems like you would need to give like quite a few reasons for just even like believing that claim. Certainly, it's not the kind of place like that you start an argument from ordinarily. And like the next part of the argument is that, well, you know, number is superior to reason. Huh? Like that too is just like it's like strange claim. And I think actually in the text it's not just number, but it's like number and wisdom. Right? Those things are superior to reason. And then we conclude, okay, God exists. You know, and we're left with a question though, based upon the first premise. The first premise told us that like if anything's superior to reason, then either it's God or there's something even better than that, and that's God. And the thing that we came up with that was superior to reason was like number. And so Augustine concludes, well, God exists. Well, then you have to wonder, like, is it his view that God is number? like, which number? Like 4? All the numbers? Just the rational ones? I mean, it's a very strange argument. I recommend, after having like thought about this like more over the course of several years, not continuously, but now and again, whenever I have to teach it, I've since thought that the argument should be approached in like a sort of a different manner. Like it's best to read Augustine here not as offering reasons that would convince like even the most like hard-headed atheist that God exists. That's not what he's doing. Okay, he's really not even offering reasons that would convince a fellow Christian who for the time being is setting aside somehow the assumption that the God of Christianity exists. Rather, I think what he's trying to do is he's trying to present in argument form what I called earlier something like a worldview, and probably it'd be better at this point to call it, but to describe it using some technical philosophical terms. He's trying to like lay out a metaphysical scheme. Okay, so metaphysics again is the part of philosophy that has to do with like the fundamental nature of reality, and so that's what this argument is mainly designed to do. It's designed to set forth a certain metaphysical scheme. Right? And the metaphysical scheme, believe it or not, is actually one that is already familiar to you by way of Plato and that discussion that we had of like the divided line and the allegory of the cave. It's similar to that scheme, and it's also, like, as a matter of fact, very similar to a scheme that was developed by and sort of promulgated by people who claimed to be renewing Plato's philosophy. These people were called, again, like Neoplatonists. And the scheme that resulted was one that not just Augustine adopted, but that many philosophers, subsequent philosophers, especially philosophers in the Middle Ages, they continued to hold to. And that scheme is called the Great Chain of Being. And it's a view on which the reality comes in levels. And on each level, what the beings have in common is that they're real to a certain extent. Right? So there are degrees of reality. And as you sort of go up the levels, right, things above order the things below. In a sense, they rule them. And so that's what Augustine is trying, by way of this argument, to sort of get across to Evodius. And he wants to get this argument across because that's going to allow him to more fully address these problems of evil. In particular, on my interpretation, this scheme is going to allow him to especially deal with that first problem of evil, the so-called underachiever problem. Right? The problem can kind of be put this way: look, I mean, if there's the God that Christians believe in, then this world has got to be like the best possible world, right? It can't be less than the best, but it appears to be less than the best. It appears like there could have been a better world, like namely a world without evil. Conclusion: yeah, God isn't all God is supposed to be by Christians. The God of Christianity doesn't exist. Okay. This metaphysical scheme, which goes by the name of the Great Chain of Being, that metaphysical scheme is going to allow Augustine to solve that problem. Okay, or at least like he thinks so. Okay. So that is where I want to leave off for today. Next lecture, as promised, work through in some detail Augustine's attempt to address those three questions in Book 2, and then turn to Book 3. In Book 3, he's going to try to address this I guess you could call it like a remaining difficulty where the holiness problem is concerned. Right? And again, like the difficulty is one that I kind of alluded to before. Like God's relationship to my wrongdoing is a little bit different. Actually, it's considerably different than my great-grandparents' relationship to my wrongdoing. Okay. In addressing that problem, sort of this remaining difficulty, he's going to say something else about will that he hadn't really said before, and it's something that is going to cause, I hate to say it, like practically like endless problems in philosophy, like from that point further, from that point on. Also, you probably didn't find the way he dealt with evil suffered like all that convincing. Again, like in Book 1, evil suffered is supposed to be not really evil because it's all like divine retribution for the wrongs that people do, right? So where evil suffered is concerned, you get what's coming to you, and so it's actually a good thing. But you may have thought, well, you know, I mean, infant mortality rates in Augustine's time were like really, really high. You know, and they're still high in various parts of the world. Surely that is evil suffered. Is it Augustine's view that somehow like babies have it coming, like that, like this is like divine retribution to like wrongs they willingly did. No, like that's not Augustine's view. I mean, he is willing to say that, yeah, that's evil suffered, but he does not consider that to be like divine retribution for the wrongs that those who suffer did. So he knows there's a problem with just kind of like dismissing all evil suffered as if it were divine retribution. Right? So there's a problem with just sort of dismissing it all as like misunderstood good. So he will address that problem too. And that's all I have for this evening.